if I told you that your spiritual level isn't measured by how many books you've read, how often you meditate, or how many spiritual retreats you've attended? What if everything you've been told about spiritual growth is backwards? Right now, as you're watching this, you might think you're on a spiritual path. You might believe you're evolving, ascending, becoming more enlightened. But Edgar Cayce, the man who accessed universal consciousness over 14,000 times, revealed something that will completely shatter your assumptions about where you really stand. He said there are 12 unmistakable signs that reveal your true spiritual level. Not the level you think you're at. Not the level you want to be at, but the level your soul has actually achieved. And here's what's unsettling. Most people who consider themselves spiritually advanced aren't. Most people who think they're awake are still asleep. Most people who believe they're close to enlightenment haven't even begun the real journey. How do I know? Because Cayce gave us a mirror, a way to see ourselves with brutal, uncomfortable honesty. And today, I'm going to hold that mirror up for you. You might not like what you see, but if you have the courage to look, really look, what you discover could change the entire trajectory of your soul's evolution. So ask yourself, are you ready to know the truth about where you really are? Let's find out. The deception of spiritual ego. Before we dive into the 12 signs, we need to talk about the biggest obstacle to accurate self-assessment. Spiritual ego. You know what I'm talking about. That part of you that wants to believe you're special, chosen, more evolved than the masses who are still asleep. It's the voice that says, I'm not like other people. I see through the illusion. I understand the deeper truths. And here's the dangerous part. The more spiritually aware you become, the more sophisticated your ego becomes at disguising itself as enlightenment. Edgar Cayce encountered this constantly in his readings. People would come to him convinced they were highly evolved souls, expecting him to confirm their spiritual superiority. And time after time, Cayce would reveal a different truth. He'd show them that their spiritual awakening was often just their ego wearing new clothes, that their higher consciousness was frequently just intellectual understanding without any real transformation, that they were performing spirituality instead of embodying it. Let me ask you something, and I want you to be honest with yourself. When you meditate, are you actually transforming your consciousness? Or are you collecting another experience you can mention in spiritual conversations? When you read spiritual books, is your life actually changing? Or are you just accumulating knowledge that makes you feel superior to people who haven't read those books? When you talk about oneness and unconditional love, do you actually treat the checkout clerk at the grocery store with that same reverence? Or is your spirituality reserved for yoga studios and meditation circles? This is where Cayce's 12 signs become so crucial, because they don't measure what you know. They measure who you are. They don't assess your beliefs. They assess your being, and they reveal, with uncomfortable clarity, the difference between spiritual performance and spiritual reality. If you're feeling defensive right now, that's actually a good sign. It means something in you recognizes the truth in what I'm saying. Hit that like button if you're willing to be honest with yourself about where you really are, and subscribe. Because this channel is for people who want truth more than they want comfort. The foundation, understanding spiritual levels. Cayce taught that spiritual evolution isn't linear. It's not like climbing a ladder where each rung is clearly above the last. It's more like deepening into an ocean. The same ocean, but the deeper you go, the more you discover depths you didn't know existed. He described the soul's journey as having many levels. Some sources say 7 major levels, others point to 12 or even more gradations within those levels. But here's what matters. Each level represents a fundamental shift in consciousness. Not a shift in what you know, but a shift in how you experience reality. At the lowest levels, you experience yourself as separate from everything. You're an individual consciousness navigating a world of other separate things. Life happens to you. You react to circumstances. As you evolve, you begin to recognize patterns, connections, the way your inner world creates your outer experience. Higher still, you start to perceive the unity beneath the apparent separation. You feel your connection to all beings. You recognize the divine in everything, and at the highest levels Cayce described, you don't just understand oneness intellectually. You live it. You are it. The sense of being a separate self becomes transparent, and what remains is pure consciousness expressing itself through the form you call you. But here's the critical insight Cayce offered. You can't skip levels. You can read about unity consciousness. You can talk about it eloquently. You can convince yourself you've achieved it, but if you haven't actually integrated the lessons of the earlier levels, you're building a spiritual identity on a foundation that doesn't exist. You're like someone who's memorized the view from the mountaintop but has never actually climbed the mountain. And the 12 signs Cayce revealed, they show you exactly which level you've actually reached, not which level you'd like to believe you're at. Sign 1. Your relationship with suffering. The first sign is the most revealing. How do you respond when life brings you pain? At the lowest spiritual levels, suffering is seen as punishment, as something wrong that shouldn't be happening, as evidence that God, the universe, or fate has turned against you. You resist it. You fight it. You ask, why me? You feel victimized by your circumstances. At intermediate levels, you begin to recognize suffering as a teacher. You look for the lesson. You try to grow from it. You tell yourself everything happens for a reason. But you're still fundamentally in resistance. You're just more sophisticated about it. At the highest levels, the levels Cayce said indicated true spiritual maturity, suffering is met with something entirely different. Acceptance without resignation, presence without resistance, an openness to what is exactly as it is. Not because you're passive or defeated, but because you've recognized a profound truth. Suffering comes from resistance to what is, not from what is itself. Think about the last time something painful happened to you. A loss, a betrayal, a failure, a health crisis. What was your immediate response? Did you collapse into victimhood? Did you spiritually bypass by immediately trying to find the silver lining? Or did you simply be with it, feel it fully without needing it to be different? Cayce said that your relationship with suffering reveals your spiritual level more accurately than anything else. Because it's easy to be spiritual when life is good. It's easy to talk about love and light when you're comfortable. But when life breaks you open, when you lose something you can't replace, when pain finds you in the dark, that's when your true level is revealed. Not by what you say about the suffering, but by how you are with it. Sign 2. Your capacity for genuine compassion. The second sign, compassion. But not the kind of compassion you might think. Cayce made a crucial distinction between sympathy, empathy, and true compassion. Most people never progress beyond sympathy, feeling bad for someone who's suffering. That's nice, but it's not particularly evolved. Empathy is deeper. It's feeling with someone, walking in their shoes, understanding their pain from the inside. But true compassion, the kind that indicates an advanced spiritual level, it's the ability to see the divine perfection in someone's journey, even when they're in hell. It's holding space for someone's pain without trying to fix it, without needing them to feel better so you can feel better, without making their suffering about you. It's loving someone enough to let them have their own experience, even when that experience is breaking your heart to witness. Here's how you know if you've developed real compassion. Can you be present with someone who's suffering without immediately trying to make it better? Can you resist the urge to offer advice, to find solutions, to spiritual bypass their pain with platitudes about growth and lessons? Can you simply be there, fully present, fully open, offering nothing but your presence and your unconditional acceptance of their experience? Most people can't, because witnessing suffering without trying to control it is incredibly uncomfortable. It triggers our own unhealed wounds. It reminds us of our powerlessness. It confronts us with the reality that we can't save anyone, not even the people we love most. Cayce taught that genuine compassion requires tremendous spiritual strength. It requires you to have done your own inner work so thoroughly that you're not derailed by other people's pain. And it requires something even more profound, the wisdom to know that their suffering is part of their soul's perfect curriculum. Not that suffering is good, not that you should cause it or celebrate it, but that you trust the intelligence of each soul's journey enough to honor it, even when you don't understand it, even when everything in you wants to interfere. Drop a comment right now. When's the last time you were truly present with someone's pain without trying to fix it? I'll heart the responses that show real self-reflection, because this is where genuine growth begins. Sign 3. Your relationship with truth. The third sign might surprise you. How honest are you? Not with others, with yourself. Cayce said that self-deception is the primary obstacle to spiritual growth, and the higher your spiritual level, the more ruthlessly honest you become with yourself. At lower levels, we lie to ourselves constantly. We justify our behavior. We rationalize our choices. We tell ourselves stories that protect our self-image. I'm not angry, I'm just passionate. I'm not jealous, I'm just concerned. I didn't betray my values. The situation was complicated. We do this because facing the truth about ourselves is painful. It requires us to acknowledge our shadow, our pettiness, our selfishness, all the ways we fail to live up to our own ideals. But as you evolve spiritually, something shifts. You develop the capacity to see yourself clearly without judgment. You can acknowledge, yes, I was jealous. Yes, I acted from ego. Yes, I hurt someone because I was protecting myself. And you don't collapse into shame about it. You don't need to defend yourself. You simply see it. This is what Cayce called spiritual transparency. The ability to be completely honest about who you are, the light and the shadow, without needing to hide, justify, or perform. Here's the test. Think about your worst quality. The thing about yourself you're most ashamed of. Can you name it right now, out loud, without flinching? Can you say, "This is part of who I am," without immediately following it with an excuse or explanation? If you can't, you're still protecting an image of yourself. You're still invested in appearing a certain way, even to yourself, and that investment keeps you stuck. Cayce taught that spiritual growth accelerates dramatically when you stop lying to yourself, when you face the truth of who you are with clarity and compassion. Not so you can beat yourself up, but so you can work with reality instead of illusion, because you can't transform what you won't acknowledge, and you can't acknowledge what you're too afraid to see. Sign 4. Your response to criticism. Here's the fourth sign, and it's closely related to the third. How do you respond when someone criticizes you? At lower spiritual levels, criticism triggers immediate defensiveness. Your ego rises up to protect itself. You counterattack, explain, justify, or dismiss the critic as someone who doesn't understand. At intermediate levels, you've learned to pause before reacting. You try to see if there's truth in the criticism. You intellectually understand that feedback is a gift, but you're still fundamentally threatened by it. Part of you still needs to be right, to be seen as good, to maintain a particular image. At the highest levels, criticism becomes fascinating instead of threatening. Someone points out your flaw, and instead of defending, you think, is that true? Let me look at that. You're genuinely curious about your blind spots. You actively seek feedback because you want to see yourself clearly. And here's the key. You can receive criticism without taking it personally. Because you've recognized that who you truly are, your essential being, can't be threatened by words, can't be diminished by someone's opinion, can't be damaged by feedback. Only the ego can be threatened. Only the false self needs to defend. Your true self, it's completely secure, completely unshakable, and therefore completely open to information about how it's currently expressing itself. Cayce said this is one of the clearest signs of spiritual maturity, the capacity to hear difficult truths about yourself without collapsing, defending, or attacking. Think about the last time someone criticized you, maybe a partner, a friend, a colleague. What was your immediate internal response? Defensiveness? The urge to explain why they're wrong? The need to point out their flaws in return? Or curiosity, openness? A genuine willingness to consider that they might see something you can't? Your answer reveals your level. Sign 5. Consistency between belief and behavior. The fifth sign is perhaps the most damning for those who identify as spiritual. How wide is the gap between what you believe and how you actually live? This is where most spiritual seekers get exposed. We believe in oneness, but we gossip about people we don't like. We believe in compassion, but we're cruel to ourselves. We believe in presence, but we're constantly distracted, half present, going through the motions. We talk about unconditional love, but we withdraw affection when people displease us. We speak about non-attachment, but we're secretly devastated when things don't go our way. Cayce was merciless about this discrepancy. He said that your spiritual level is determined by your lowest behavior, not your highest understanding. You can have mystical experiences. You can understand non-duality intellectually. You can speak eloquently about enlightenment. But if you're still petty, defensive, judgmental, and reactive in your daily life, you're not as evolved as you think, because real spiritual growth changes behavior, not just belief. It makes you kinder, more patient, more honest, more present, more capable of love, even when love is difficult. And these changes aren't performative. They're not something you do to appear spiritual. They're the natural result of consciousness transforming. Here's the uncomfortable question Cayce would ask if someone followed you around for a week, watching how you treat waiters, how you respond when you're cut off in traffic, how you speak to your family when you're tired. What would they conclude about your spiritual level? Would they see someone living their values, or someone with a significant gap between their self-image and their reality? This isn't about perfection. It's about integrity. It's about the distance between who you say you are and who you actually are, getting smaller and smaller as you evolve. Subscribe to this channel if you're ready for this level of honesty, because we're going to keep pushing into territory that most spiritual content avoids, the gap between performance and reality. Sign 6. Your relationship with the present moment. The sixth sign. How often are you actually here? Not physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. Cayce taught that presence, true presence, is the foundation of all spiritual development, and it's also the clearest measure of how far you've come. At lower levels, you're almost never present. You're lost in thoughts about the past or future, replaying conversations, planning, worrying, fantasizing, regretting. You're anywhere but here. At intermediate levels, you practice presence. You meditate. You try to stay aware. You catch yourself when you drift into thought and bring yourself back. But it's effortful. It requires constant vigilance. The default is still distraction. At the highest levels, presence becomes natural. Not because you're trying to be present, but because you've recognized yourself as presence itself. You've discovered that you are the awareness in which all experience appears. And from that recognition, being present isn't something you do. It's what you are. Here's the test. Right now, in this moment, can you feel the aliveness in your hands? Can you sense the energy field of your body? Can you be aware of the space around you without getting lost in thought about it? For how long can you maintain that awareness before your mind pulls you back into its stream of thinking? 30 seconds? 2 minutes? An hour? Cayce said that your capacity for sustained presence, not forced concentration, but relaxed awareness, reveals your spiritual development more accurately than any other measure. Because everything else, compassion, honesty, non-attachment, love, all of it emerges from presence. You can't be genuinely compassionate if you're not present enough to actually perceive the other person. You can't be honest if you're not present enough to see yourself clearly. You can't let go of attachment if you're not present enough to notice your gripping. Presence is the foundation. Everything builds on it. So how present are you? Really, not how present you'd like to be. Not how present you are during your 20-minute meditation. How present are you during the mundane moments? Washing dishes, sitting in traffic, having a conversation with someone you've talked to 1,000 times before, that's your real level. Sign 7. Your need for external validation. Sign 7 cuts deep. How much do you need others to recognize your worth? At the lowest spiritual levels, your entire sense of self comes from external validation. You need people to like you, praise you, acknowledge you, see you. Without that reflection from others, you don't know who you are. You feel empty, invisible, worthless. At intermediate levels, you've developed some internal sense of worth. You're not completely dependent on external validation, but you still care. Maybe more than you'd like to admit, what people think of you. You still get a hit of pleasure when someone praises you. Still feel deflated when you're ignored or criticized. Still perform for approval, even if you're performing not caring about approval. But at the highest levels, something extraordinary happens. You become so anchored in your essential being that external validation becomes irrelevant. Not because you've convinced yourself you don't need it, but because you've discovered something so much more substantial than other people's opinions that they simply don't move you anymore. Cayce described this state as spiritual self-sufficiency, not isolation, not arrogance, but a profound inner completeness that doesn't need anything from anyone to confirm its existence. Here's how you know if you've reached this level. Can you do something beautiful, creative, or generous and have absolutely no one notice? No acknowledgement, no praise, no recognition, and feel completely fulfilled by the act itself? Can you be completely yourself, authentic, vulnerable, imperfect, even when you know it might make people uncomfortable or cause them to judge you? Can you receive praise without inflating and criticism without deflating, because neither one touches the truth of who you are? Most of us are still seeking, still performing, still needing the world to confirm that we matter. And that need, subtle as it might be, reveals that we haven't yet found our true center. Cayce taught that this shift from external to internal validation is one of the most significant thresholds in spiritual development, because once you cross it, you're finally free to be who you actually are instead of who you think you need to be to get approval. Sign 8. Your relationship with material reality. The 8th sign addresses a question many spiritual seekers get wrong. How do you relate to money, possessions, and physical comfort? At lower levels, you're either attached to material things or you're in reaction against them. You either chase wealth and comfort as the source of happiness, or you reject them as unspiritual. Both positions reveal the same thing. Material reality still has power over you. At intermediate levels, you try to practice non-attachment. You tell yourself that things don't matter. You might even give away possessions to prove your spirituality. But underneath, there's still tension, still judgment, still a sense that the material world is somehow less important than the spiritual world. At the highest levels, the distinction collapses. You recognize that consciousness is expressing itself in all forms, including material forms. Money is just energy. Possessions are just expressions. The physical world is just as sacred as any spiritual realm, so you can have things or not have things with equal peace. You can be wealthy or poor, and it doesn't change who you know yourself to be. You use material resources in service of your purpose, but you're not defined by them. You enjoy comfort when it's available, but you're not dependent on it. Cayce put it simply. The spiritual and material are one. There is no separation except in the mind of man. Here's the test. Could you lose everything tomorrow, your home, your savings, your possessions, and not lose yourself? Could you gain great wealth and it not change your fundamental being? If the answer to either question is probably not, then material reality still has hooks in you, and those hooks reveal that part of you still believes the illusion that you are what you have, rather than what you are. Sign 9, your capacity to forgive. Sign 9 is where many people discover they're not as evolved as they thought. How completely can you forgive? Not surface forgiveness. Not I forgive you, while still holding resentment. Real forgiveness. The kind that completely releases the past. At lower levels, forgiveness is conditional. You'll forgive if they apologize, if they change, if they suffer enough. If you get some form of justice or compensation, your forgiveness is a transaction, a negotiation, a way of maintaining control. At intermediate levels, you understand that forgiveness is for you, not them. You practice it as a spiritual discipline. You work on letting go. But it's hard. It takes effort. Part of you still wants to hold on to the grievance because it gives you a sense of moral superiority or protects you from being hurt again. At the highest levels, forgiveness is instantaneous and complete, not because you're forcing it, not because you're spiritually bypassing the pain, but because you've developed the capacity to see that everyone is doing the best they can with the consciousness they have. You recognize that the person who hurt you was acting from their own pain, their own unconsciousness, their own wounds. And that recognition doesn't excuse the behavior, but it dissolves the need for revenge or resentment. Cayce taught that unforgiveness is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. It binds you to the past. It keeps you energetically tethered to people and events that should no longer have power over you. And your inability to forgive reveals that part of you is still identified with being a victim, still deriving some benefit from the story of how you were wronged. Here's the question. Is there anyone in your life you haven't fully forgiven? When you think of them, do you feel tension, anger, the urge to explain to someone else how they wronged you? If so, you're still carrying that weight. And that weight is an anchor preventing your consciousness from rising. True spiritual maturity shows itself in the ability to release the past completely, not by pretending it didn't happen, but by no longer needing it to define you. Sign 10, your relationship with uncertainty. Sign 10 reveals how much you still need to be in control. How do you handle uncertainty and the unknown? At lower levels, uncertainty terrifies you. You need plans, guarantees, clear paths forward. When life becomes unpredictable, you panic. You try to control everything, people, outcomes, circumstances, because not knowing what's going to happen feels unbearable. At intermediate levels, you've learned to tolerate uncertainty. You practice surrender. You tell yourself to trust the universe. You use affirmations and spiritual concepts to manage your anxiety about the unknown. But underneath, you're still fundamentally uncomfortable with not knowing. You're still trying to control by pretending you're not trying to control. At the highest levels, the levels Cayce's said indicated genuine spiritual mastery. You've fallen in love with uncertainty because you've recognized that the unknown is where all possibility lives. That mystery is the nature of existence. That trying to know and control is what creates suffering, not uncertainty itself. You've developed what Cayce called radical faith. Not faith that everything will turn out the way you want, but faith that whatever happens, you can meet it. You can be with it. You can grow from it. You trust life, not because you believe it will always be kind, but because you've discovered something in yourself that can handle whatever comes. Here's the measure. Can you make an important decision without knowing the outcome? Can you step into the unknown without a guarantee of success? Can you live your life as an adventure into mystery, rather than an attempt to create security? Most people can't, because most people are still trying to construct a life where nothing unexpected happens, where everything goes according to plan. But that's not spiritual maturity. That's spiritual avoidance. Real growth happens in the space of not knowing, in the willingness to move forward, even when you can't see the path. Cayce taught that your relationship with uncertainty reveals whether you've truly surrendered to the intelligence of life, or whether you're still trying to play God with your tiny human understanding. If you're feeling challenged by these signs, good. That means you're actually listening. Share this video with someone else who's ready for real spiritual honesty. And subscribe, because we're building a community that values truth over comfort. Sign 11. Your capacity for solitude. Sign 11 addresses something crucial that most people overlook. Can you be alone with yourself? Not just physically alone, truly alone. No distractions, no phone, no music, no activities. Just you and your consciousness. At lower levels, solitude is unbearable. You need constant stimulation, constant connection, constant distraction from your own mind. Because when you're alone with yourself, you encounter everything you've been avoiding. Your anxiety, your self-judgment, your existential emptiness. So you fill every moment. You keep yourself busy. You make sure you're never truly alone. At intermediate levels, you practice solitude. You meditate. You take solo retreats. You value quiet time. But there's still an agenda. You're being alone in order to achieve something, to find peace, to have insights, to become more spiritual. You're still doing, even when you're being still. At the highest levels, solitude becomes a kind of homecoming. You're not alone to achieve anything. You're alone because that's where you discover you're never actually alone. In deep solitude, the sense of separation dissolves. You recognize that consciousness itself is your true companion, that you are the presence that witnesses everything, and that presence is connected to all existence. Cayce taught that masters could spend years in complete solitude and emerge more connected to humanity than most people who spend their entire lives surrounded by others. Because real connection doesn't happen through constant contact. It happens through depth of presence, and you can only develop that depth when you're willing to go deep into yourself without distraction. Here's the test. Can you sit alone, in silence, for an hour without becoming anxious or reaching for a distraction? Can you be with yourself, with all your thoughts, feelings, and sensations, without needing to escape, fix, or change anything? If you can't, you're still running from yourself, and you can't evolve beyond what you won't face. Sign 12. Your relationship with service. And now, we arrive at the 12th and final sign. The one Cayce said was the ultimate measure of spiritual development. How do you serve? Not whether you serve. How and why? At lower levels, if you serve at all, you do it for recognition, for approval, to feel good about yourself, to balance some karmic debt or earn spiritual points. Your service is transactional, ego-driven, conditional. At intermediate levels, you've learned that service is important. You volunteer. You help others. You try to make a difference. But there's still a subtle sense of separation. You're the helper, and they're the helped. You're giving from your abundance to their lack. There's still an I who is doing something for them. At the highest levels, service becomes as natural as breathing. You're not serving because you should, not because it makes you feel good about yourself, not because you're trying to save anyone. You serve because you've recognized yourself in everyone. You help because there is no other to help. There's only consciousness serving itself through different forms, and this kind of service is unattached to outcome. You give without needing appreciation. You help without needing success. You serve without needing to see the results of your service, because you understand that your role is simply to be a channel for love, compassion, and wisdom to flow through. What happens after that isn't your concern. Cayce described this as egoless service. Service that comes from such a deep recognition of unity that there's no one there to take credit, to feel pride, to claim ownership of the good being done. Here's how you know if you've reached this level. Can you serve someone anonymously, truly anonymously, where no one will ever know it was you, and feel the same fulfillment as if you were publicly recognized? Can you help someone who will never thank you, never acknowledge you, maybe never even know you helped them? Can you give everything you have in service of something greater than yourself and feel more full, not less? That's the mark of spiritual maturity. That's the sign that you've transcended the ego's need to be important and discovered the joy of being useful. The integration. So here we are, 12 signs, 12 mirrors reflecting back the truth of where you really stand. And I'm guessing that if you've been honest with yourself, truly honest, you've discovered some gaps. Some places where what you believed about yourself doesn't quite match reality. That's not a failure. That's the beginning of real growth. Because you can't evolve beyond where you are until you're willing to see where you are. The spiritual ego wants to skip ahead. It wants to claim the highest levels without doing the work of the earlier ones. It wants to talk about non-duality without developing basic compassion. It wants to discuss enlightenment without practicing daily honesty. It wants to identify as awakened without serving anyone but itself. But Cayce was clear. You can't bypass the levels. You can only integrate them. Each sign builds on the previous ones. Each capacity develops from the foundation of earlier capacities. You can't have true compassion without presence. You can't have presence without honesty. You can't serve egolessly without first developing the ability to be alone with yourself. It's a journey, a process, a gradual deepening into the truth of what you are. And here's the beautiful part. You don't have to be perfect at all 12 signs to be on the path. You just have to be willing to see where you are and work with that reality instead of pretending you're somewhere else. Cayce taught that self-awareness without judgment is the key. You can acknowledge, I'm not very good at forgiveness yet. I'm still learning to be present. My service is still somewhat ego-driven. And that acknowledgement, without the shame or the need to defend, opens the door to transformation. Because you're no longer wasting energy maintaining an illusion about yourself. You're using that energy to actually grow. The practice. So, let me give you something practical to take from this. For the next week, I want you to pick one of these 12 signs, the one that challenged you most, and make it your focus. Not to fix it, not to master it, just to observe it. If it's presence, Notice how often you're actually here versus lost in thought. Don't judge it. Just notice. If it's compassion, observe how you respond when someone shares their pain. Do you immediately try to fix it? Do you make it about you? Or can you just be there? If it's honesty, pay attention to the small ways you deceive yourself throughout the day, the stories you tell, the ways you justify your behavior. Just observe, with curiosity instead of judgment. And here's what will happen. Your awareness of the pattern will begin to shift it. Not through force, not through willpower, but through the natural intelligence of consciousness seeing itself clearly. This is the practice Cayce recommended over and over. Not more information, not more concepts, not more spiritual techniques, just honest self-observation, day after day, moment by moment, watching yourself without judging, seeing yourself without defending, being with what is instead of what you wish were true. And slowly, imperceptibly at first, you'll notice shifts, small changes, moments where you respond differently than you used to. That's evolution, real evolution, not dramatic, not flashy, just the gradual transformation of consciousness becoming more aware of itself. Final words. So here we are at the end of our journey through the 12 signs, but really, this is just the beginning of your journey with them. Because these signs aren't something you learn once and move on from. They're living mirrors that you'll return to again and again throughout your spiritual evolution. Each time you look into them, you'll see something different. You'll discover new depths. You'll recognize patterns you couldn't see before. Because as your consciousness evolves, your capacity to see yourself evolves with it. What you couldn't acknowledge last year becomes obvious this year. What seemed impossible to change gradually becomes natural. What you thought was your highest level becomes the foundation for the next level beyond it. The journey never ends, but it also never leaves you where it found you. Every moment of honest self-observation, every instance of choosing truth over comfort, every small act of letting go, it all matters. It all accumulates. It all contributes to the evolution of your consciousness. And that evolution, that's why you're here. That's the purpose beneath all purposes. That's the game consciousness is playing with itself through the form you call you. To know itself more deeply, to express itself more fully, to recognize itself in all things and all beings. You're not on this path by accident. You're not watching this video by chance. Some part of you, the deepest, truest part, called for this understanding, this reflection, this moment of seeing yourself clearly. Honor that calling, trust that impulse toward truth, and keep walking, keep growing, keep opening. The universe is unfolding exactly as it should, and you, exactly as you are, right now, at whatever level you've reached, are a perfect and essential part of that unfolding. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being willing to look at these difficult truths. Thank you for choosing consciousness over comfort. Leave a comment sharing which of the 12 signs you're committing to work with this week. Let's support each other on this journey. I'll be reading every single comment and engaging with this community we're building together. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Because this is just the beginning of the conversations we're going to have about real spirituality. The kind that transforms you from the inside out. Until next time, remember Cayce's most important teaching of all. You are a spiritual being having a human experience, not the other way round. And the more you remember that truth, not just intellectually, but experientially, the more everything else falls into place. You're so much more than you know, and your journey is so much more magnificent than you can imagine. Trust the process. Honor where you are, and keep growing toward the light that you already are. I'll see you in the next video.